Welcome to the 2020 Environmental Arts and Humanities Network webinar series. I'm Hayley Singer, the convener of the Environmental Arts and Humanities Network, and I'm zooming into you from Bunurong country, the land of the two bays, where I live as an uninvited settler on unceded lands. I pay my respects to the traditional owners and knowledge bearers of this place, and I also acknowledge that this webinar is taking place during NAIDOC Week, a week born from resistance and protest, but also a week of celebration of the oldest living cultures on Earth. This webinar series invites scholars, artists, and storytellers to reflect on ways that environmental arts and humanities can provoke deep engagement with and robust community discussion about the multiple and overlapping environmental and cultural crises of our times. And I'm really looking forward to today's webinar on feminism in a climate emergency, to be presented by Dr. Lara Stevens, who will offer renewed attention to the archive of eco-feminist philosopher Val Plumwood, and that will be followed by a response made by Jennifer Hamilton. Dr. Lara Stevens is an eco-feminist scholar and artist, and the author of Anti-War Theatre After Brecht, Dialectical Aesthetics in the 21st Century, and also co-editor of Feminist Ecology's Changing Environments in the Anthropocene. Dr. Jennifer Hamilton's research sits between feminist environmental humanities and literary studies. Her publications to this end include This Contentious Storm, an eco-critical and performance history of King Lear, and along with colleague Street Anemonis, publications like Composting Feminisms and Environmental Humanities and Weathering. Hi, Lara. I'm super excited to have you here with us today. Before I hand over to you, I'll just mention one more practicality for the audience. We're going to be managing questions today, both through the chat function, but also through the Q&A function. So anytime throughout the hour, please post your questions there. And after Jen's response, I'll be collating the questions and putting them to our speakers. And I'm sure it'll be a really excellent discussion. So thank you, Lara. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Hayley, and thanks everyone for zooming in and giving up your precious morning to think about feminism and the climate emergency. I'm very grateful that you've taken the time to do that. I too would like to acknowledge that I'm also zooming in from the Phillip Island, and it's the land of the Bunurong people also, and I want to pay my respects too to their elders past, present and emerging. And I think that this respect is particularly important for a paper like this, which wants us to pay more attention to our relationship to place, to country, and in particular to those extraordinary women who have over thousands of years developed sustainable ways of living with the land, as part of the land, and have fought for the land's protections from colonial practices. I'd also like to, before I begin, acknowledge a debt to the former caretaker of Plumwood Mountain, Anne Edwards, for her extraordinary work in that place and for also providing some of the eyewitness details about the sorts of things I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today. And also thanks to the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute for inviting me here, and to Brendan and Sangeetha who run that fantastic institute as well, and to Claire and Anna for organising today, and to Hayley Singer and Jennifer Hamilton for being a part of this event. I'm very grateful to have such brilliant minds here with me. So I want to begin today by telling you a little story about last summer. Might be something that rings a little familiar with your own experiences last summer. So in the summer of 2019 to 2020, like many people living in the city of Melbourne, remote from the kind of unprecedented bushfires that were blazing across Australia, I sat anxiously by my computer, waiting for updates around several fires, in particular, the Currowan State Forest fires of New South Wales. Plumwood Mountain a place that is not only rich in some of Australia's unique biodiversity, but also a place that should be treasured in Australia's cultural and environmental history, was being seriously threatened by those fires. So in May of 2019, I had visited and stayed on the property of Plumwood Mountain, and I had admired, these are my photographs from that stay, admired its subtropical rainforest understory with its spectacular ferns, its plumwood trees, its vibrantly coloured mushrooms that you can see there, the antechinus that lived in the lounge room, the fearless and varied bird life that congregated around and inside, sometimes, the house, the powerful owl that swooped our car one night as we were returning home from the local pub in the dark. And I was there to visit the former home and property of Australian philosopher Val Plumwood, who passed away in 2008 and who named herself after the plumwood trees there on the mountain. Plumwood is not a household name in Australia, though I argue she should be. I'm sure there are many who would agree with me. But she is globally recognised as one of the most significant environmental thinkers in history. She and her former husband built a rudimentary dwelling in the middle of the rainforest at the end of what is now a long and rocky track. They also built a shed, planted a garden, and laid the foundations for a guest house that in 2019 was soon to be opened as part of a place for writers in residence where they could visit and do writing as part of the BRU network, the Bush Retreats for Eco-Writers. So to give you a sense of the geography of Plumwood Mountain and where it's located, so it's near the historic town of Braidwood, so you sort of travel through Braidwood along the King's Highway for anyone who's been in that part of the world. And on one side, and you can see on this map, in the south, west, you can see the Mongan National Park, and the escarpment on the southeastern side of Plumwood Mountain looks out to the New South Wales coast near Bateman's Bay. So in December 2019, then the Currowan State Forest fires get out of control. The King's Highway is closed. Some of the neighbours stay to defend their properties, and an anonymous friend of the mountain risks their personal safety to drench the rafters of Plumwood's place, move the gas bottles and petrol flammables away from the house. The Currowan fires do eventually reach the house, and you can see here where they burst the 3,500 litre water tank, the shed, which is only metres from the house, which is this image on the top left of your screen, is completely burnt out. Around the dwelling, the understory is black. But seemingly miraculously, the fires skirt around the house and the guest house, which is about 100 metres away. And so it's surmised that these two dwellings were saved by the burst water tank and also Plumwood's ornamental garden, which she had planted with high water content species such as rhododendrons. And according to Anne Edwards, the former caretaker there, this garden was planted with fire in mind. So like many, I feel intense grief upon reading about the billion species killed in the fires, the injured and maimed animals, the devastated lives and homes of human inhabitants of fire-ravaged towns, the spike in domestic violence that occurs as a response to the stress of all these losses, as well as the severe impacts upon pregnant women and their babies, and those who suffer from asthma and other respiratory illnesses. And on top of that, we had almost lost the home and contents of Plumwood Mountain. And this includes Plumwood's personal papers, her extensive personal library with its significant marginalia, she scribbled all over the books, videos, meaningful objects kept in the house. And this archive is such an important complement to her academic papers, which are housed at Australian National University and have been there since her death. So you can see in the bottom left-hand image that there's the house with the kind of burnt understory around it. So against the backdrop of a sometimes kind of recalcitrant political response to the fires, I get an email about a local wildlife group the native animal rescue group, who were venturing into the areas around Plumwood Mountain, not yet classified safe by the authorities, to leave pellets and water for any surviving wildlife. So my talk today then, giving you that kind of background story, is to sort of divide it into two parts, I suppose. One is to talk to you about who Val Plumwood is as an environmental philosopher and a feminist, and why I believe her work is so valuable to us now, navigating our way through the present environmental crisis. And also what then the kind of second part is to think more generally, well, what is the relationship between gender and environment more broadly today, and what is going on with that? So first of all, why Plumwood is significant. Here she is. So since the 1970s, Val Plumwood has been an influential voice in arguing for environmental justice. She is globally celebrated, as I mentioned, for her pioneering contributions to the field of environmental ethics and feminism, as well as her successful activist campaigns. Her work was interdisciplinary, but her training and teaching mostly happened in philosophy. So this is a very strongly male-dominated field, particularly at the time when she got her degree and she topped her class in the early 1960s. I mean, it was almost unheard of that women would be doing philosophy then, but it continues to be a very male-dominated and masculinist field even today. So her position then as a woman with expertise in feminism and philosophy means she's been kind of doubly marginalized, and really her archive hasn't received the kind of attention that it deserves. There is still an enormous amount of work to be done in uncovering her unpublished papers, in understanding how her ideas were informed by her lived experience and knowledge of Plumwood Mountain. So she's not only a unique and trailblazing thinker that we should celebrate for her remarkable contributions to Australian history, but her ideas were so ahead of their time that they also have a lot to offer us for better understanding and more effectively responding to today's problems regarding gender and the environment. So the relationship between the ecological dwelling that she built at Plumwood with its rudimentary off-the-grid technologies, the library that's there, its intellectual gatherings and her famous kind of parties, the forest office that she had at Plumwood Mountain, the ornamental garden, and the whole relationship between the kind of forest more generally and her work has a lot to reveal about her radically innovative social and environmental views. So the first thing to notice is that she was a leading voice in the eco-feminist movement. So I want to explain for people that don't know about this movement, and I know many of you are very well versed in it, but just to get everyone on the same page, I want to set up a little bit of a kind of understanding of what feminism has to do with ecology, because it's definitely not kind of immediately obvious. So ecofeminism has shown how women in the natural world have been both mistreated because they've been historically aligned. So you only need to think of a term like Mother Nature to grasp how deeply ingrained this kind of feminization of the natural world is within our psyches. She looks after us, she feeds us, clothes us, nurtures us. We have little obligation back to her, the earth. She is there for human pleasure, comfort, to sustain our needs, desires, and growth. So ecofeminism comes out of 1960s kind of countercultural movements, so civil rights movements, LGBT, gay rights movements, gay and lesbian rights movements, environmental protection movements. It coincides with land art, kind of the use of land in performance and in visual art. It also strongly comes out of sort of following World War II and the use of the A-bomb in World War II, anti-nuclear movements and anti-war movements, women's movements, Indigenous rights movements, and also intersects with, very importantly, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring from 1962. So there's kind of all these different elements going on that kind of bring about ecofeminism. And I think it's a problematic and sort of misleading term, ecofeminism, because it's not just kind of Mother Nature, as it were, or women that have been treated like dirt, but central to ecofeminism's critique is the way that Western cultures treat minority cultures, any minority culture. So it could be colonial subjects, Indigenous populations, the poor, the disabled. These are all groups that are routinely devalued and degraded. So like intersectionality, which is very popular and kind of becoming more, people are becoming more sort of aware of what that means today, ecofeminism is groundbreaking for linking up these different oppressions and systems of oppressions and showing how they're mutually reinforcing one another. So it adds to the idea of that racism, classism, and sexism, it adds speciesism. The idea that, you know, humans shouldn't necessarily be the top of the list in the kind of species hierarchy. And Plumwood's work in particular was revolutionary because it went back to ancient Greek philosophy, to the foundations of Western thought, and it showed how women, children, slaves, and nature were all grouped together and shown to have similar attributes. They were mutually derided, devalued, instrumentalized, and portrayed as objects of mystery that had to be mastered and controlled. And it wasn't always necessarily negative, but it was that they were always, you know, used as points of comparison with one another. So Plumwood showed how these attitudes of the ancient Greeks kind of carried through to the modern world. And we might say she exposed how these unconscious biases kind of infiltrate how we think about nature and any kind of other. So the question is, well, why is this so important? Like, aren't these Greek guys kind of long dead? And isn't it just a very small kind of elite group that studies philosophy now? Like, isn't it sort of unlikely that given all our technological progress, our scientific advancements, our social advancements and rights for different marginalized groups, that we've kind of thrown out these sexist associations that lack a sort of scientific or evidential basis? And I think it would be really nice to imagine that these links have kind of disappeared. But I also think it's very difficult when you stack up, you know, events like Donald Trump. I get to say the former US president, which is kind of a nice thing to be able to say, as a man of kind of at the pinnacle of wealth and power and privilege, bragging about grabbing women by the pussy, or the way in which our former Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, was once described as Julia Gillard, Kentucky Fried Quail, small breasts, huge thighs, and a big red box. Or the way that influential media personality Eddie Maguire and his supporters described Indigenous football star Adam Goodes as an ape or King Kong. So I wish I could say that these kind of were a series of unlucky kind of coincidences in their associations, but I think it's very difficult to argue that when you kind of stack up the weight of evidence. And I thought it was really interesting as well, watching Biden's kind of acceptance speech recently for the US presidency, and the way he kind of listed the things he was going to do. You know, he was going to end racial inequality and he was going to improve education, and he talked about the way he was going to get the climate under control. And I thought, that's so, that language still of control, of mastery, that what our job is to do is to get the climate under control, I think really demonstrates the way we're just so, you know, even for people that are passionate about responding to the climate crisis, are still using this rhetoric of mastery and control as if it's something that we can control and should control, you know, while also developing our own growth and moving forward in our society. So ecofeminism then gives us a historical consciousness to show where attitudes of mastery come from, what ideological function they served, and what other ways there are of conceiving of the relationship between the human and the world. So once you have a historical consciousness, you can see that things haven't always been this way. So as we're looking for a way out of the climate crisis, or to mitigate the climate crisis or stop the climate crisis, we also have to believe that our species is capable of living otherwise. And when we see that there are other ways of living, you know, whether it's in the past or, as many eco-feminists did, going to Indigenous groups and looking to present day, current other ways of living, which are sustainable for the long-term survival of our species, then we have a model, we have a kind of map through the crisis and a sense of what it might look like. So it's incredibly important. Ecofeminism exposed human and non-human hierarchies of vulnerability to crises, to environmental crises. So it showed how women are 14 times more likely, this is a recent statistic, 14 times more likely to die in catastrophic climate events and more vulnerable to long-term negative impacts through increased exposure to violence during and after that, through reduced income and impoverishment and unequal access to resources and constraints on movement and freedom. And we've seen all these things in the bushfires, we've seen them in COVID too. The spike as well, it's not just the spike in family violence that's kind of happened with bushfires or with the COVID-19 pandemic, but I also think it was really interesting that very early on in the pandemic, once again, there were reports, I remember these back in May, of men who were trying to weaponize the virus as a means to keep women in the home or keep them wherever they wanted them, and saying things like, I'm going to bring the virus, you know, in here if you don't do what I want. And so again, in these kind of conditions of extreme stress, the impulse, and it's not some kind of inborn impulse, this has to be something which is socialized into boys and men, is coming through to kind of weaponize this thing that we can't control, this non-living organism, which we're all pretty frustrated with and our inability to control it at the moment, but to kind of feign a sort of control over it in order to get what they want in a frustrating and difficult, stressful time. So Plumwood's most famous, this is the Pine Gap Women's Peace Camp, which was an important kind of moment of ecofeminism, kind of protesting nuclear energy and nuclear weaponry, that followed the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in England, which became very famous, long-standing over many, many years. And there was an Australian version, and I think Pine Gap's, yeah, still running. So this is Val Plumwood's most famous book. It's considered a classic of ecological writing, and she critiques the kind of hyper-separation of the human and nature in this book. And she really implores readers to sort of start to see how enmeshed the human is within what we destroy. So when we destroy the planet, when we hurt nature, we're also hurting ourselves. And she talks about, and was a big player in kind of environmental debates about the worth of the non-human, measurable outside of its utility for human kind of value, measurable outside of what she calls instrumental value. So not as an instrument, it has worth in and of itself. And this idea of intrinsic value of the non-human world is, so not just animals or living things, but also things like air or rocks or, you know, something like the virus. This is so ahead of its time that we're really just starting to catch up to some of these ideas now. So, for example, in 2016, after extensive advocacy for over 140 years from Maori groups, the New Zealand government granted the Wanganui River having the same legal rights as a human being. So it was recognised that this river is an ancestor to these people. It was seen as being part of an indivisible whole that was incredibly essential to their well-being and part of their lives, and not something that should be owned or managed. I think it's interesting as well, in 2019, ACT in Australia became the first kind of legal jurisdiction in Australia to recognise pets as sentient beings. And so it created legal ramifications for the abuse of domestic animals. And it was a law that recognised that animals can feel and perceive the world around them. And so they deserve a quality of life that reflects their intrinsic value. And they actually use that language of intrinsic value, which I think is really interesting, comes directly from kind of eco-feminist and environmental ethics philosophy. Just moving on quickly to, this is probably Plumwood's most famous essay, Being Prey, from 1996, which describes her escape from a saltwater crocodile in Kakadu National Park, and the crocodile put her in a death roll several times, and she almost died from kind of being drowned, but also from blood loss. And this canoe that she was in is now in the National Museum of Australia, and there's just been a special wing opened in that museum, which is dedicated to environmental history in Australia and celebrates Plumwood's achievements. So this event kind of changed her philosophy forever, and it kind of helped her critique individualism and argued for humans to kind of, again, open their body to the interchanges with the world, to move away from anthropocentrism, to see themselves further down in the kind of chain of hierarchies of being. So why is Plumwood relevant today? Well, we're responding to climate emergency on multiple levels. We still struggle to see the interconnections between ourselves and the non-human world, though I think COVID-19 has helped us to make some of those connections in a positive way, to see the way that we're kind of intermeshed in the world. We also struggle to admit our dependency on the human world and our helplessness as well towards environmental catastrophes, because we've so often told ourselves the narrative that we're the ones that should be the masters and in control. And I think if we can't sort of recognise the interconnections between ourselves and the biosphere, then we're not going to find solutions to get out of this great existential crisis of our generation. And I think the same can be said of various feminist concerns and other social injustices that are still tied to environmental degradation. So if we take kind of the examples of coal mining or various mining in Australia, and the actions of mining groups, it's not only the land that's being affected, the increased kind of carbon that's being released in these sort of situations, but it also has overlapping negative impacts upon different groups of people. So it's long been researched the increase in domestic violence in mining towns and communities, the increased alcoholism and suicide rates in those areas because of the stress of what's called the two-speed economy, the very wealthy sort of mining economy versus the kind of normal economy. And also, of course, the effects on Indigenous country and the health and well-being, the spiritual impact of the destruction of those, very important and spiritually significant lands, such as what we've seen recently with the Juukan Gorge. I'm running out of time, but briefly, I think just to touch on also Black Lives Matter, these are kind of, major social justice movements that are, triggered, it seems, by the kinds of violences inflicted on African-American men by state forces. But if we begin to sort of scratch the surface of these movements, we also note that it was a movement begun by 3 feminists who you see here: Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garcia, and Opal Tometi. And I think it's important to think about, why is it women who are spearheading these movements? Why is that not kind of common knowledge? And I think it's also really telling to know that Colours began her career as an environmental activist and is still talking about the way that environmental change affects Black and Brown lives to a greater, much stronger and more acute degree than white lives. So why is it women and girls, particularly women of colour, that are leading the charge? Well, the first answer to this is that they are the first to witness the uneven gendered and racial effects of environmental change. They are also more perhaps compelled to take action, not just because they see the effects firsthand, but also because they're less compromised by their position already kind of on the margins. So they're the ones usually dealing with the waterways, with the subsistence farming methods. They're connected to food, water, waste, cleaning through their primary care, giving roles, caring for children, the elderly and the sick. But also, you know, they're also largely excluded from the public sphere and the professional labour force. So that kind of gives them a sort of an advantage, I suppose, in being less compromised. There's less to lose or nothing to lose from rejecting the kind of current system and demanding a more equitable future for women and children and the biosphere. So I will leave you then with the words, so I don't go too over time, of Greta Thunberg, who has obviously been another kind of female leader, and it might be worth us discussing or thinking further about why, you know, it is Thunberg who's made such an impression, and why, whether it's a coincidence, once again, that she's a young girl. But Greta Thunberg says, if the solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We've come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. Okay, I'll leave it there and hand over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Lara. Jen, we'll call you in now.
Oh, hello. Hi. Thank you so much, Lara, for that comprehensive survey of not only Plumwood's body of work, but ecofeminism and its legacy across time and cultural context. I also want to thank Hayley and Anna and Claire for the invitation today, and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Anaiwan country, the custodianship of which is shared with the Dunghutti, Gamilaroi and Gumbaynggirr people, and acknowledge that sovereignty over the land and waters up here were never ceded. There's so much that could be said, but I really want to pick up on this point that Lara was making about control, because I think it's sort of, for me at the moment in my thinking, at the heart of everything. And I am doing this thing that I've never done before, which is speaking a response to what I just heard, rather than having prepared something in advance. So let's see how this goes. As Lara has said to us, this idea of control and the quest for mastery that was so sort of well articulated by Plumwood in Feminism and the Mastery of Nature back in '93, I guess relates to these hierarchical structures that that feminism, or most broadly, sought to respond to. So that's like the patriarchal structure, the colonial structure, and the associated white supremacist kind of rollout of colonization across the globe. And then, of course, also the economic structure, capitalism, where the exploitation of labor is kind of, and the control of a labor force is required for the management of things, and the production of wealth for a few. And what concerns me in this moment, and Lara, I'm echoing a point you've already made, is this idea of seeking to control the climate is doubling down on these logics of control that are in the hierarchies that we are trying to live amongst and resist and deconstruct, and have been trying to do so for a number of decades or even centuries, depending on when you take the kind of origins of feminist politics from. And so I guess as a sort of statement, and a standpoint theory in some regards with regards to climate emergency, I think feminism in a time of climate emergency must, as a point of departure, resist the logics of emergency itself, which are in the current sort of popular discourse around emergency about control and coercion and about giving extraordinary powers to the police and the military, all of which are structures that were established under patriarchy, under colonization, and serve to kind of double down on these hierarchical logics that we're living within. So an uncritical uptake of climate emergency as a point of principle because we care about the environment is not going to get us very far as feminists seeking intersectional, intergenerational justice. But I guess then the question is, what do we do? And I don't have all the answers to that, but I guess I wanted to say that I'm pretty interested in toxic masculinity as a site for thinking through the complexity of what it means to resist emergency logics, because we can resist them and we can do so much work, intellectual work, community building work, community organizing work, teaching, research, writing, events, and yet in parallel there's a kind of resurgent toxic masculinity. I can't, the laundry list of kind of horrors that are happening in parallel are substantial. So I guess I just wanted to plant this seed as an important pressure point that we need to think about and think through the complexity of, and that is like the difficulty of confronting toxic masculinity in our society, and that is, I guess, in our workplaces, in intimate relationships, in our families, in our political system. And in the spirit of, I guess, composting, which is something that Estrida Namenis and I developed together, which is kind of not just always about like barreling forward and finding the new fancy theory, but somehow like recycling and going back to even our own old work. This work is not that old. It's only 3 years old. I'm not, a hugely sort of senior scholar. So I wanted to just screen share, if I can, a little section from my book on King Lear. Can you all see that? I'm just going to read it out and then I'm just going to leave it because we don't have that much time and I want to leave enough time for conversation and questions. But I guess the reason I thought to go back to this is that Lear for me is an archetype, maybe even like an character of a form of toxic masculinity that we have in literary history. This character was constructed in 1605, 1606 by Shakespeare, and yet seems quite familiar today. And I guess I don't want to put that up there and say, well, this problem's always been around, we're never going to be able to deal with it. But what are the resources that we have at our disposal now in the wake of sort of decades/centuries of feminist work to confront this? So I'm just going to read it and then I'll leave it. This is my King Lear for you all. I prithee, daughter, do not make me mad. I will not trouble thee, my child. Farewell. We'll meet no more see one another. But yet thou art my flesh, my blood, my daughter, or rather a disease that's in my flesh, which I must needs call mine. Thou art a boil, a plague sore, an embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood. But I'll not chide thee, let shame come when it will, I do not call it. I do not bid the thunder bearer shoot, nor tell tales of thee to high judging Jove. Mend when thou canst, be better at thy leisure. I can be patient, I can stay with Reagan, I and my 100 knights. So this is Lear's response to his daughter when she says, look, I can give you a lodging tonight, Dad, but I just don't want you to bring those 100 knights. It's too much, I can't look after them too. And he kind of flips out and characterizes her as a plague sore in his corrupted blood. And I guess this is cut and paste from my book, which you can look at on open access on Bloomsbury Collections. But it's sort of all of these logics of hierarchy and control and contempt for not just women and daughters, but also kind of the materiality of being and bodies comes across in this passage, I think. And this is, as I think, and I'll just read it and not try to like meta-analyze it. As part of an attempt to regain control of the body politic by masking his shameful, ailing and aging body, and it's only shameful because he was a king. This is part of a bigger argument about shame and the mortal body in this play. The aggression directed towards Goneril's female body is a perfectly and irreducibly abject response to, quote, the baleful power of women to bestow mortal life. For Lear, Goneril represents the mother that gives life but without infinity. That he equates her subjectivity with the body itself. Oh, I've edited this to make it better, but then I've just made it that a partial sentence. Anyway, she exhibits power over his weakened body, and this only makes him feel more ashamed of his own weakness. In attempting to regain control of the authority held under the auspices of immortality bestowed upon him as king, Goneril's newfound power serves to underline the relationship between mortality and powerlessness. As a king formally charged with the rule of the body politic, his sense of self was expansive. If he seems monomaniacal, it is because his body once symbolized everything in the kingdom except its own liveliness. The psychosocial reckoning required to confront his mortal body and vulnerability, to surrender power and control, is substantial. So I'm just going to leave it there. I think that what is that reckoning and how do we foster it is a question for feminists in a time of climate emergency. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We've got at least one question coming through. If anybody else has any other questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat. But first, I want to open up to you again, Lara, and to just offer you time to respond to what Jen has said while some questions come through.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jen, for that thoughtful response. And I love the King Lear kind of analysis. I mean, I don't feel I have much to add to that, but I think that you're so right in pointing out the parallels between the policing, the kind of all we're confronting with the policing and the military, and the kind of militarization of states at the moment, and what's going on with the climate as well. But I also, yeah, and I love that you're using that in relation to kind of thinking about, you know, a kind of contemporary term around toxic masculinity, because when I was also reading back through some of my notes about Francis Bacon, who's supposed to be like the father of, you know, modern science, he's like also another template of kind of toxic masculinity in the kind of way that he writes. You know, he talks about penetrating the earth, and you know, it's all of these metaphors of rape, and how, you know, she's both kind of really mysterious and kind of delicate, but we also then really need to use force and keep her to kind of bring her under control. So, and I thought the same thing about that kind of, that toxic masculinity was a really kind of nice, useful way to describe his rhetoric. But I love it in relation to King Lear as well. Yeah.
Yeah, actually the New Atlantis, which is Bacon's like a utopian vision of what a society totally controlled by science looks like, is also an extreme hierarchical patriarchy. Like the family structures in that, it's a very kind of short story. You can kind of, if people want to read it, it doesn't take that long, because I don't think he ever finished it. It's sort of an incomplete tale. But yeah, like all utopias, it has a very particular social order in the context of this scientific experiment kind of being important to be able to kind of control all of the experiments. You also need to be able to control everyone's emotions and control the way in which they relate to one another. And yeah, I think it's a great another example of that sort of long history of the way control and the quest for control structures the problems that we are kind of trying to undo.
And that in a kind of social media age as well, the ways that those links, people can link up and organize collectively now and share emotion and share anger and share their stories, as well as how it can be used by Trump in the opposite kind of way, to spread more toxic masculinity. Yeah, it's also like, I wonder what kind of they would have made of that, you know, new sort of techno sort of addition to our way of living and socializing now. Yeah, anyway. I also wanted to say, you know, also this is just maybe, since there doesn't seem to be other questions at the moment. Yeah, it was interesting that you said, Jen, that composting was old or something, because I also had, I mean, which is not, and it's very relevant, and everybody's talking about that work, and it's very exciting and interesting. And I think it's also, I've been told by a few people that Plumwood's work is too old and it's done, and not to use it as a kind of intellectual framework for publishing things and by journals. And I think we've got to be also really on our guard against this kind of idea that, oh, that stuff's kind of had its day or it's like used up, because there's so much, you know, value. And I mean, especially for something like composting feminism, which is only, you know,
what I meant about that article, I mean, there's lots going on in it, but one of the, I think, main things that Streeter and I wanted to convey was exactly sort of what you're saying, that the old is not useless and can be reused and recycled, and it is a kind of an argument against the regime of disposability, and like which comes with the ideas of academic innovation and originality, and that seems to be accelerating in the present. Like, and I think that, yeah, Plumwood being kind of a has-been is a example of that.
I absolutely agree with that. It's a real problem for the academy, and then for everyone that should benefit from it.
On the topic of control, I do have a question here. Somebody is asking a question about the roles that women can play in institutions where the idea of control over the environment is strongly exhibited, and this person seems to work as an environmental regulator. So what are some of your thoughts on that? How to sort of resist in those environments?
I mean, that's so interesting. So thank you for whoever asked that question. I don't know, Lara, I just jumped in here because I used to be a flatmate of mine was a urban ecologist, like working for a local council, and she would always come and tell me the like pretty wild rules that they had. So what her role was to try to bring sort of, you know, a different logic into the urban landscape and kind of wild places, but you couldn't have shrubs because like strange people could lurk behind shrubs. You could only have like grass and trees, and, you know, so how do you actually do that? I wonder if, and this is maybe going to sound a bit twee, but if like conversations in the workplace, like collective conversations about these things could actually be generative, because people get really siloed. Like in the environment, it's like she was an urban ecologist in the ecology wing, and the planners and the finance people and the, you know, parking fine people, you know, they're all like in these separate little worlds, whereas the environment kind of it is holistic. And so she needed to be able to have some sway in the planning discussions and in the regulatory discussions. So yeah, like trying to break down those silos somehow, even just in your workplace. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to know the specifics of what is being kind of regulated in that environment, but that it does pose a really interesting question, and I'm not sure how to respond without the specifics, but just to say that surely, you know, there's a lot of environmental regulation that's trying to push back against kind of, even though the term sounds kind of, I guess, part of the mastery narrative that's trying to push back against that patriarchal, you know, kind of hierarchies, you know, and protect the environment from more of that sort of abuse, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you. I would love for that conversation to continue, and we should probably have a webinar on that exactly. But I've got a question here around Plumwood and thinking about Plumwood and deep ecology. And this questioner, Terry, has said that whereas deep ecology has an ethics of moral rules and obligation, Plumwood emphasises an ethic of care and love for other species. Lara and Jen, would you be happy to speak to this sort of way that Plumwood thinks about deep ecology and feminism and the mastery of nature, but also about Plumwood's ethics of care?
Yeah, sure. Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean I know that Plumwood and Ariel Soleil and Freya Matthews kind of really pushed back, I think, against the kind of deep ecologists, still seeing as their kind of position as quite masculinist in its idea. So I think, again, there's a kind of a real movement at the moment, which is quite exciting, towards thinking about you know, kind of contemporary ethics of care through things like the Black Lives Matter movement, and the way in which that's kind of founded on like an ethics of care that's part of their manifesto. And it's really at the basis, and I think it runs along the same philosophical lines as the Plumwood's kind of ethics of care, is really to also a care for self first, especially as kind of grassroots organisers of, you know, Black Lives Matter movements, really looking after themselves first so that they can help and support others rather than burning out, which is a really common thing that happens in kind of activist circles, whether it's environmental or social activism. So I think that kind of manifesto, there's another group that wrote a really, I can't think of their name at the moment, that they're a kind of collective that published a kind of manifesto of care as well. That's, I can go and see if I can find it, but yeah, thank you for that point. I think it's really important kind of movement at the moment.
The other comment, I guess, to add to that is critiques of Plumwood that have come out of from Indigenous scholars in Australia. And as far as I'm aware, this hasn't been published yet, but it's come up in a number of seminars that I've been in, and in particular around being prey. So this is slightly different, a bit tangential, but I think it relates to particularly like when you fold it back into a discussion about deep ecology, which it's not only masculine, it's kind of pretty white and coming out of kind of settler colonial places and often not totally engaging with that history. And I think that same critique has been levelled at Plumwood, and in relation to her time with the crocodile, near-death experience with the crocodile, having apparently, you know, there's a lot of kind of pushback against the way that essay doesn't really address sort of being an uninvited settler in particular lands. And that I think it doesn't, like, in some ways I think the Being Prey article is looking at particularly Western frameworks of subjectivity and desire for immortality and control over the self. But yeah, it doesn't quite go so far as to kind of then engage in the bigger sort of socio-political trouble of the land in Australia. And it's definitely something that is part of Plumwood's work. So there's like, people are butting heads over this at the moment. But I think both in deep ecology and in ecofeminism, we always have to be conscious of complicity in settler colonialism and how to be decolonizing in our work, which is hard work, but essential.
Just to maybe guide this back to the point of the idea of care and the intimacy of care, I have got a question that sort of addresses that point. This person is asking, as a new parent, I found most of the advice given is about controlling your child, and they're just wondering if this is where things can start, and whether shifting the conversation to maybe gentle parenting is how you change the system from the ground up. And how might this relate to environmentalism and society?
Yeah, I think I'm returning at the moment to psychoanalysis and affect theory in my reading, and I think that's kind of like, this is coming back to this chapter in my book, the chapter on shame. I'm writing about like mortality and stuff, and also I'm part of this smooth hand fish vigil, so I've been thinking about mourning and grief and what emotions I'm capable of conjuring. And I think, you know, the role of a parent is to kind of socialize a child or children. This is social reproduction kind of 101. And I guess we have like so many interesting kind of models for what that is in our thinking around kind of alternative kinship making practices. And, you know, it's been heavily critiqued, including by me, but I guess the most iconic example is in environmental humanities is Donna Haraway's Camille stories, which is a sort of theory of alternative social reproduction. She doesn't even want to call it social reproduction because she doesn't want to duplicate the social. So yeah, I think that parenting absolutely plays a role. Like each individual parent can't do very much on their own, because I think it's not just about mother and child, but it's about what the family unit represents socially and economically, and in terms of land relations. But yeah, I definitely think parenting has a role, and so like dig in and investigate the possibilities there. That's my...
It's such a complicated question, because you kind of don't want to put yourself into that question, but I love it. But I think it also speaks to the individualization of the way our societies are structured and the atomization of parenting today, because it's not done predominantly, or in my experience, it's not done in community, right? And so, you know, it's left to a very small kind of group of people to do the kind of socializing and the kind of, you know, the rule making around how the child kind of develops. And I think that if it was a broader community, you would kind of naturally have more input, and so it would be already more diverse, and you would be getting different messages coming through, and that might be really healthy. I don't know what gentle parenting is. I would like to know a bit more about that. But yeah, I think there's a lot. I mean, these questions intersect a lot with kind of the contemporary structures of family and child rearing, and the role of the mother, particularly too, and the grandmother as well. So thanks.
Thank you both so much for your responses. There are more questions, but we are at time today, unfortunately, so we're not going to get to any more questions today. But there are two references that you both mentioned. Lara, you spoke about a manifesto for care. I think I'll get the details from you and send them around to the participants from today. And also, Jen, I would love to know more, and I think listeners would love to know more about the Smooth Hand Fish Vigil that you are part of. So if there's details for that, I'll also send that around to the audience. You, the audience who I can't see, thank you so much for coming today, for being present for this conversation, for asking your questions. Our next and final webinar will be in the first week of December, and it will look at sustainability and storytelling. We'll give you details of that when we have them. Jen, Lara and I are going to stay on the line to have a bit of a debrief, and you, lovely audience, will all be very respectfully escorted to the digital door. So please don't be alarmed when that happens. But once again, thank you so much, Lara and Jen. And I want to thank the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, because without their support, this event would not be able to take place. So thanks for coming today, everybody. And Lara, Jen, maybe we'll turn our cameras off while everybody's being escorted, and then we can become animated humans again.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hayley.